Ethan Carter had always been the kind of person people gravitated toward. He wasn't the loudest in the room, nor was he the most confident, but there was something about him that made people feel comfortable. Maybe it was his easygoing attitude, or maybe it was the way he listened, really listened, when someone talked. Whatever it was, it made him the glue that held his little group of friends together. A senior anthropology student at Crestwood University, Ethan was finally approaching the finish line of his academic journey. His passion for uncovering the past had been ingrained in him since childhood, fed by the many summers he had spent with his grandfather, a retired archaeologist. While other kids played video games, Ethan sat on dusty library floors flipping through books on lost civilizations, ancient burial sites, and the eerie folklore of forgotten towns. His dreams weren't grandiose. He wasn't looking to be the next Indiana Jones or host a high-budget documentary series. He just wanted to discover something that mattered, something that would cement his name in the academic world and open doors for him. His final thesis, a culmination of 4 years of hard work, was supposed to be his ticket to success. But there was one problem. He didn't have a subject. Ethan had spent weeks scrambling for inspiration. His classmates all seemed to have their topics locked in. Ancient trade routes, indigenous burial customs, lost dialects of forgotten tribes. Meanwhile, he was stuck bouncing between half-baked ideas that had already been researched 100 times before. "You're overthinking it," his best friend Marcus had told him over a greasy diner breakfast last weekend. "You always do this, man. Just pick something cool and run with it." Marcus had been Ethan's friend since freshman year. A history major with a deep love for conspiracy theories, Marcus was the kind of guy who could talk for hours about any given topic, regardless of how much he actually knew about it. He had a contagious energy that always made Ethan feel better about things. "I just don't want to waste this opportunity," Ethan had sighed, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "This could set me up for the future. If I pick something forgettable, I'm screwed." "You're gonna find something," Marcus had said, confidently biting into his third strip of bacon. "Probably when you least expect it." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, and what if I don't? You think I could just make something up? Write about how aliens built the pyramids?" Marcus grinned. "Now you're thinking. Make it entertaining enough and no one will question it." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Right. Because academic journals love conspiracy theories." Ethan's family had always supported his academic pursuits, though they never fully understood them. His parents, both middle-class office workers, had raised him in a small town where football was king and books were an afterthought. They were proud of him, of course, but when he spoke excitedly about burial rites or oral histories, their eyes tended to glaze over. His younger sister, Mia, on the other hand, got it. At 14, she was already showing signs of following in his footsteps, devouring books on mythology, and sketching ancient artifacts in her notebooks. Ethan often joked that she would be the real success story of the family. "I bet you'll find some crazy undiscovered civilization someday," she had told him over FaceTime a few nights ago. "And then I'll say I always knew my brother was a genius." He had laughed. "Let's hope I can even pick a thesis topic first," she had grinned. "Don't worry, something's gonna find you." It was Tuesday morning when everything changed. Ethan had woken up early, groggily scrolling through his phone while sipping his usual cup of black coffee. As he absent-mindedly scrolled past news articles, something caught his eye. Local rumors surrounding Blackwood dig, strange findings unverified. Blackwood. The name meant nothing to him. He clicked the article, leaning forward as he read. It was short, barely a few paragraphs. A small excavation project in a town called Blackwood had unearthed unusual stone formations deep inside a natural cave system. The team supposedly found symbols that didn't match any known civilization, but the article admitted there were no real conclusions yet. No experts had weighed in. It was more of a local curiosity than anything else. The post had almost no engagement, no real discussion, just a couple of comments, mostly dismissing it as a hoax or unimportant. Something about it sent a jolt through Ethan's body. This was it. This was his topic. His thoughts raced. What kind of discovery was this? Why was no one talking about it? Should he really go? Or was this just another overhyped non-story? His heart pounded with excitement as he grabbed his laptop and began searching. Blackwood wasn't far, about a 5-hour drive. Remote, sparsely populated, and mostly known for its old mining operations. Nothing about it had ever been significant. Until now. He tapped his fingers against the desk, mind spinning. This could be my break. The big project that sets me apart. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. Marcus. Dude, you find your golden ticket yet? Marcus's voice was laced with amusement. Ethan hesitated before replying. Maybe. Ever heard of Blackwood? There was a pause. Blackwood? Nope. Should I have? Ethan frowned slightly. No, I guess not. It's just, I came across this weird excavation thing online. Nobody's really talking about it, but I think there might be something interesting there. Marcus snorted. Bro, you're seriously about to drive 5 hours for a no-name town with a cave? Ethan grinned. That's what makes it interesting. If it were all over the media, it'd already be flooded with people. But no one's talking about this. That means I get there first. Marcus sighed. Man, you're way too into this stuff. That's why I'm gonna get published before you, Ethan shot back, smirking. Marcus laughed. Fair. Just don't get eaten by cave monsters or whatever, all right? Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. I'll be fine. I just want to check it out. What's the worst that could happen? As he hung up, that strange feeling crept back into his chest. Why did it feel like no one was supposed to find out about this place? Ethan bought his bus ticket at a small, dimly lit station on the outskirts of town. The place smelled of old upholstery and cheap coffee, and the man at the counter, grizzled, sunken-eyed, looked up at him with a slow blink when he asked for a one-way ticket to Blackwood. Blackwood? The clerk's voice carried a tinge of disbelief. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Ain't many people going there. Ethan offered a polite smile. Yeah, I'm doing research for my anthropology thesis. Thought I'd check the place out. The man didn't respond immediately. He just looked at Ethan for a beat too long, then exhaled through his nose. Huh. Well, if that's where you are heading... Something about the way he said it made Ethan's stomach turn. Not the words exactly, but the way they sounded. Like he knew something Ethan didn't, but dared not speak it aloud. Was he trying to warn me? Or just making conversation? Ethan couldn't tell, and he wasn't about to ask. The man printed his ticket and slid it across the counter without another word. Ethan took it, suppressing the shiver creeping up his spine. The bus ride started normally enough. The passengers were mostly silent, either dozing off or staring blankly out the window. But there was something off about them. Ethan noticed it about an hour into the trip. The way they sat too still, their breathing shallow, their faces expressionless. They weren't talking, not even to each other. There was a strange sameness about them, like they were all part of some tight-knit community that didn't welcome outsiders. He shifted in his seat. Come on. It's just a small-town thing. They probably all know each other. That made sense, didn't it? But something about them made his skin prickle. Then, about halfway through the ride, a woman slid into the seat across from him. Ethan hadn't even noticed her boarding. She had deep-set eyes, dark hair pulled into a loose braid, and skin that looked pale, almost translucent under the sunlight filtering through the windows. She turned her head toward him, and her gaze locked onto his. No greeting, no expression, just staring. Ethan waited for her to say something, but she didn't. She just watched him, too still, too focused, as if trying to see through him. His throat felt dry. Say something, he thought, but she didn't. A cold sensation crawled up his spine. The other passengers had been strange, but this was something else. Something about her wasn't right. After a long, breathless moment, she turned away, as if he had ceased to exist. Ethan exhaled. Pulse quickened. What the hell was that? He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to shake the sensation that her eyes were still on him. The landscape outside grew more desolate as they neared Blackwood. Dense forests lined the narrow roads, mist curling between the trees like skeletal fingers. The sun hung high in the sky, but somehow, the further they went, the more muted the light became, as if the land itself was draining the color from the world. Ethan leaned against the window, his eyelids growing heavy. The gentle hum of the engine, the rhythm of the winding road, it was lulling him into sleep before he could fight it. And then, he dreamed. He was standing in a vast, sunlit expanse. A warm breeze curled around him, carrying whispers in a language he didn't recognize. In the distance, a stone altar loomed, carved with symbols unlike anything he had ever seen. Ancient, unfamiliar. Nothing from any recorded religion. The runes shimmered faintly, pulsating with a strange energy. He took a step closer. What is this place? His heart pounded with curiosity, but unease stirred beneath it. He had never seen symbols like these before. Had anyone? And then he saw her. A woman standing near the altar, bathed in the glow of the daylight. She was breathtaking. Long flowing hair that moved like ink in water. Skin so smooth and pale, it looked almost luminescent, like she belonged to a world untouched by time. Her lips were full, deep red, and curved into an inviting smile. But it was her eyes, impossibly large, dark, and filled with something both alluring and dangerous, that held him in place. She raised a hand, beckoning him closer. His heart pounded. There was something wrong, but he couldn't look away. Her beauty was hypnotic, pulling him toward her, making his thoughts hazy, sluggish. I should turn around. I should leave. But he couldn't. He was being drawn in, step by step. And then he saw the gills. Small, delicate slits along the sides of her neck, expanding and contracting as if she were breathing in water rather than air. As she stepped forward, the sunlight revealed the subtle shimmer of scales along her forearms, blending seamlessly with her otherwise flawless skin. Ethan tried to move, to step back, but his body refused. The air felt thick, pressing in on him from all sides. Wake up now. The woman tilted her head, her smile never faltering. And then, in a voice that echoed like a song from deep within the ocean, she whispered, "Finally, I will see you. You are here." A shockwave of fear coursed through Ethan's body. He gasped awake. The bus lurched as it pulled to a stop. The world snapped back into focus, the unmoving passengers, the driver staring straight ahead as if he hadn't even noticed the abrupt halt. Outside, a battered wooden sign stood by the roadside, barely illuminated by the fading afternoon light. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to shake off the lingering weight of the dream. Just a dream. That's all it was. Right? And yet, as he stepped off the bus onto the damp ground, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen something real, something that had been waiting for him. And now, he was here. The hotel was even worse than Ethan expected. From the outside, it looked like a rotting corpse of a building, its once white paint peeling like old skin, its windows coated in grime. The sign hanging over the entrance read simply, "Lodgings." The letters so faded they looked like they were trying to disappear. The inside wasn't much better. The air was damp, smelling faintly of mildew and something organic. The wallpaper curled at the edges, and a dim, flickering light bulb buzzed overhead. It didn't look like a place where people actually stayed. More like a place that remembered being a hotel, but had long since stopped trying. A man stood behind the counter. He was tall and impossibly thin, with pale, almost translucent skin, like something that had spent too long in the deep ocean. His hair was slicked back, wet-looking, though Ethan saw no trace of moisture in the air. His eyes were bulbous, slightly too round, as if they weren't meant for human sockets. His fingers, ridged, with faint webbing stretched between them. He sat on the creaky bed, flipping open his notebook. All right, the cave. From what he had read, the excavation team had uncovered an ancient underground structure within a cave system near Blackwood. No official reports had been released, But the whispers online claimed the site didn't match any known civilization. That's what Ethan wanted, to document it himself, to be the first to truly explore it. I won't go in too deep. Just take a look, get some photos, maybe see if there are any artifacts lying around. If it was too dangerous, he'd come back later with proper gear. He'd learned enough in field studies to know that caves were unforgiving places. A cold feeling prickled at the back of his neck. Why does this feel bigger than it should? Shaking it off, he packed his camera and a flashlight into his bag. Tomorrow would be the real start of his project. The streets of Blackwood felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still, like the entire town was holding its breath. Many buildings were abandoned, their windows shattered, doors warped, as if the place had been decaying for decades. The only open store was a small general shop, tucked between two boarded-up buildings. The inside was almost empty. Dust-covered shelves held only canned fish, bags of flour, and a few dull knives. The shopkeeper, a hunched old man with sallow skin, barely acknowledged Ethan's presence. Ethan grabbed a can of soup and some stale bread from the shelf, placing them on the counter. "Just something quick to eat," he muttered, more to himself than to the shopkeeper. The old man didn't answer. He just stared, blinking once. Slow, deliberate. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine. After a long moment, the man finally reached over and dropped a flashlight on the counter. "That'll do," Ethan muttered, handing over a few bills. The old man's fingers brushed against his palm, and for a split second they felt slick, like something freshly pulled from water. Ethan nearly recoiled but forced himself to remain casual. The man never spoke a word. As Ethan stepped out, he realized his hands were shaking. Further down the street, Ethan spotted a church, or at least something that resembled one. The building looked ancient, its stone exterior worn down by time, yet there were no crosses, no stained glass, no markers of faith. It felt empty, but not abandoned. Then he heard it. A foul stench wafted from inside, something rotten and damp, like old seaweed mixed with decay. Then, a low, guttural chanting drifted from within. Ethan's breath hitched. The voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking anything he recognized. The intonation was wrong, the syllables slippery, elongated, almost bubbling, like something speaking through a throat not made for human language. Some sounds didn't belong in a human throat. He took a step closer. Inside, through the warped wooden frame, Ethan saw a group of figures standing in a tight circle, heads bowed, arms raised towards something in the center. His pulse spiked. In the dim light of flickering candles, Ethan saw it, the symbol from his dream, etched into the stone floor beneath them. A spiraling design, twisting inward, yet somehow infinite, like a path that had no end. Their movements unnatural, their bodies twisting slightly too much with each phrase. A deep wave of wrongness washed over him. Every part of him screamed to turn back. He was the only outsider here. If they noticed him... Ethan took a slow step back, then another. A soft scraping sound came from inside, like bare feet moving across stone. Then, one of them turned. Ethan's breath hitched. The figure's eyes gleamed too large, too wet, reflecting the candlelight like the surface of a deep ocean trench. That was enough. He turned and walked away briskly, forcing himself not to break into a run. Tomorrow, he'd go to the cave, take some photos, maybe explore a little, and then he'd get his ticket home. Maybe I'm overreacting. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. So what if there's another religion here? Just because it's different from Christianity doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe I'm just seeing things that aren't there. His thoughts drifted, his mind reaching for something familiar. Home. He pictured his family gathered around the dinner table, the warm glow of kitchen lights, his mom serving a steaming plate of food while his sister talked about her latest school project. The contrast was so stark it almost hurt. He was here, alone, in a place that felt like it had been forgotten for a reason. His chest felt tight, but exhaustion won over his nerves. His body sank into the creaky mattress, his eyelids heavy. By the time he reached his hotel, his skin was clammy with cold sweat. He entered his room and locked the door immediately. His pulse was still hammering. He rested his hands on the dresser, trying to steady himself. What the hell was that? His mind replayed the sounds, the chanting, the way they didn't sound human. I shouldn't be here. He pushed the thought away, exhausted. The trip had drained him more than he realized. Still in his clothes, he collapsed onto the creaky mattress, his eyelids already heavy. Tomorrow, I'll see the cave. I'll just rest for now. As sleep took him, one last thought flickered in his mind. They knew I was watching. Then, the room sank into silence. Ethan woke up to whispering. His eyes fluttered open, the room still cloaked in the heavy dark of night. At first, he thought he had imagined it, that it was just a remnant of some half-forgotten dream. But then he heard it again. Low voices, murmuring just beyond his door. He arrived today. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He is alone. The whispering was hushed, but something about their voices was wrong. Like a layer of wetness coated each syllable, like their tongues weren't made for human speech. He lay frozen, barely breathing, as his heart pounded in his chest. Do you want him now? Silence. Then the door handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Ethan shot up in bed, his breath caught in his throat. He had locked it. They couldn't get in. The handle rattled once, then again. Then it stopped. For a second, Ethan let out a shaky breath, thinking they had left. Then came the first loud thud against the door. His entire body jolted. They were breaking in. Another thud, harder this time. The wood groaned under the force. Ethan's mind raced. The window? Number 2 high. Nowhere to hide. His eyes darted to the door. The fire escape. The next blow splintered the doorframe. He had seconds. Ethan lunged for the window, throwing it open. A gust of cold, humid air rushed in, carrying the overwhelming stench of rotting fish. Below, the fire escape stretched downward, rusted and barely stable. No time to hesitate. The door shattered behind him as he climbed out. His feet hit the metal grate of the fire escape. The structure groaned beneath his weight, but it held. Ethan scrambled down, skipping rungs, nearly slipping on the damp iron. The night air clung to him like seawater, thick and suffocating. By the time he hit the ground, the town had swallowed him whole. It was almost pitch black. Streetlights, if there had ever been any, weren't lit. Windows were dark. The entire town looked abandoned, lifeless, as if its residents had no need for light. A cold breeze slithered through the empty streets, carrying the reek of decaying fish and damp earth. The humidity made his skin slick, clammy with sweat and fear. It had to be close to 9 or 10 p.m., but the town felt frozen in time, neither fully alive nor fully dead. A sudden noise behind him, a scuffle of movement. He ran. The silence of the town made his own footsteps sound deafening. He sprinted, twisting through narrow streets, his breath ragged, his heart pounding like a war drum. A glance over his shoulder. Shadows moved. They were following him. Not running, but walking, calmly, purposefully. Yet no matter how fast he moved, they were gaining. His lungs burned. He turned a corner, nearly colliding with a pile of broken wooden crates. His foot caught the edge. He stumbled, barely catching himself. He needed to hide. Now. Then he saw it. An old wooden storage hatch beneath a boarded-up shop, slightly open. A cellar. Without thinking, Ethan lunged for the doors, pulling at the worn wood. It wouldn't budge. He could hear them approaching. He yanked harder, his nails splintering against the damp wood. Come on. Come on. He slammed his shoulder into it, desperation turning to blind panic. Footsteps. Too close. With one final bone-rattling pull, the door gave way. Ethan stumbled into the darkness, slamming the door shut behind him just as the figures turned the corner. Through a thin crack in the wood, he saw them pass. Pale, elongated faces. Unblinking eyes. Their heads turned slightly, scanning, searching. their unblinking eyes cutting through the darkness like glassy orbs. Ethan clutched his chest, forcing himself not to breathe too loudly. What did they want from him? His mind was spiraling. God, let me get out of here safely. Should he run? Flee into the unknown? Just flee into the woods? A chill crawled up his spine. Who were they? Then, from the darkness behind him, a small pat on his shoulder. Ethan spun around, his breath caught in his throat. A figure stood there, a man, barely visible in the dim light. His eyes were sharp, his face gaunt, his clothes disheveled. Before Ethan could scream, the man grabbed his wrist in a vice grip and hissed, "You scream, and we both die." Understood? Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as the man's grip tightened around his wrist. His voice was a whisper, sharp as a blade. "You scream, and we both die. Understood?" Ethan nodded, his pulse pounding in his ears. Slowly, the man released him and took a step back, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes sunken yet alert, darting toward the cellar doors as if expecting them to burst open at any second. "Who?" Ethan started, but the man shot him a look so fierce it silenced him instantly. For several agonizing moments, they listened. Outside, the streets remained eerily silent. The creatures, those things, were gone. For now. The man exhaled through gritted teeth and finally spoke. "Come with me, quietly." The old man led Ethan deeper into the basement. The space was cramped, cluttered with discarded crates and rusted tools. But in the farthest corner lay a nest of old blankets, a few empty cans of food, and a small axe resting at the man's side. It was clear. He had been hiding here for days, if not longer. The man sat against the wall, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He looked around 45, his face hollowed by hunger and sleepless nights. But there was something strong in him still, a will that refused to be crushed. Finally, he spoke. "What's your name?" Ethan hesitated. "Ethan." A tired nod. "I'm Richard." Silence stretched between them. Ethan swallowed, his body still shaking. What the hell is happening in this place? Richard let out a humorless laugh. "You don't know? Jesus, kid." He exhaled, leaning his head back against the cold stone wall. "They lured you here, didn't they? Just like they lured me." Ethan blinked. "Lured?" Richard's jaw clenched. "My wife and I, we travel. We look for adventure, hidden places, places no one else thinks to explore." He let out a hollow chuckle. "This time, I thought I'd found something truly special. An untouched cave system, some forgotten ruins. But the moment we arrived, it was too late." A cold pit formed in Ethan's stomach. "Where is she?" Richard's fingers curled into fists. "They took her, separated us." His voice cracked, but he swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "They locked me up in some tiny room for 3 days, fed me nothing but rotten fish. Kept saying I didn't smell right." Ethan's skin crawled. "Smell right?" Richard nodded, his expression dark. "The others, the ones they take, aren't just killed. Not right away. They're changed, molded into something else. I think..." He hesitated, as if saying it out loud made it real. "I think they're being prepared for something." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. "Prepared for what?" Richard shook his head. "I don't know. But I saw them take someone toward the caves. I think she was alive. I have to believe she's alive." Ethan could hear the pain in his voice, the way it wavered between hope and despair. Richard's hands trembled slightly, but he clenched them into fists, trying to hide it. Ethan wanted nothing more than to get away from this place. Every instinct told him to run, to leave and never look back. But looking at Richard, at the devastation on his face, he felt something shift inside him. He couldn't live with himself if he walked away from this. If he had the chance to save someone and chose not to. Richard noticed the change in Ethan's expression. His own eyes welled slightly, the hardened mask cracking just a little. "You mean it?" Ethan nodded. "We have to find her, today, and we kill as many of those bastards as we can." Richard wiped at his face roughly and exhaled sharply. "Damn right." Richard adjusted his grip on the axe and fixed Ethan with a hard stare. "Listen carefully. If you want to live, you follow these rules. 1. You only move at night, but never under the moon." Ethan frowned. "Why?" Richard's expression darkened. "They see differently under the moonlight. It's when they're strongest. 2. Stay in the shadows. They're not blind, but they don't see well in complete darkness. 3. Never stay in one place too long." He gestured to the basement. This is temporary. They'll search again. 4. If they catch you, they won't kill you right away." He hesitated before adding, "And you do not want to know what happens after that." Ethan shuddered. Richard inhaled deeply. "There was another man in the cell with me. He was your age." Ethan tensed. "What happened to him?" Richard's expression hardened. "They took him. I never saw him again." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He could have been me. Richard ran a hand through his hair, then spoke again more quietly. "I don't think they were ever really men." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What?" Richard nodded slowly. "They're something else. Something wrong. Their skin, it's slick, pale. Their eyes are round, empty, like they were made to see in the dark. They don't talk much, just stare. And they have gills." Ethan stared at him. "Gills?" Richard tapped his own neck. "Here. I saw them up close. Webbing between their fingers, too." He exhaled heavily. "They're not human. Maybe they were once, but not anymore." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then we make sure we don't end up like them." Richard gave a firm nod. "Take this." He reached to the side and grabbed an old rusted machete, pressing it into Ethan's hands. "It's not much, but it'll do the job." Ethan tested the weight of the weapon. It felt right. Silence fell between them. Outside, the wind howled softly through the abandoned streets. Finally, Ethan spoke. "So what now?" Richard's fingers tightened around his axe. "We find my wife. We find out what's in that cave. And if we can, we burn it all down." Ethan took a deep breath. His life had already changed forever. There was no turning back now. He gripped the machete tighter. "Then let's do it." The night swallowed them whole as Ethan and Richard crept through the desolate streets, their weapons gripped tightly. The air was thick and salty, heavy with the scent of rotting fish and damp earth. Not a single street lamp was lit. The town lay in utter darkness. They moved silently, sticking to the shadows between the buildings, avoiding open spaces where the moonlight touched the ground. The rules were clear: stay unseen, stay silent, and never trust the quiet. Yet something felt wrong. The town was too still. The air carried an unsettling pressure, as if something was waiting, watching. The creatures were here somewhere. Richard gestured toward an old crumbling building up ahead, his former hotel. "This is where they kept me," he murmured, voice barely audible. "If she's alive, maybe they kept her here too." Ethan swallowed and nodded. Then they moved. The entrance was half collapsed, the doorway warped from years of neglect. They stepped over shattered glass and broken wood, their boots muffled by a layer of moist dirt that had crept into the building over time. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something old and foul. The lobby was a wreck. Chairs overturned, wallpaper peeling in thick curls, a rotting chandelier hanging like a corpse from the ceiling. Ethan's heart pounded. Something had lived here, recently. Richard moved forward with purpose, his grip tight on the axe. He paused at the old reception desk, staring at the wall behind it. The guest book still sat there, covered in dust. Richard hesitated, then reached out, flipping it open. Ethan leaned closer. The last signed name, his wife's. His knuckles whitened around the pages. She had been here. He exhaled sharply, slamming the book shut. We checked the rooms. They moved up the stairs, their footsteps careful, deliberate. The steps creaked under their weight, the wood weakened by time and damp rot. The hallway was lined with old doors, some missing, some barely hanging on their rusted hinges. Richard's breathing was shallow as he scanned each one. Then he froze. One of the doors stood slightly ajar. Inside, the furniture had been overturned, the mattress slashed open. And then Ethan saw it. Carved deep into the rotting wall, etched with a rusted nail, were two words: "Save me." Richard let out a shaky breath, his fingers brushing over the jagged letters. The cuts were fresh. "She's alive," he whispered, voice breaking. "She's still alive." Ethan felt a chill run through him. Someone, something, had kept her here. But where was she now? A sudden noise snapped them back to reality. A low, wet shuffle from somewhere downstairs. They weren't alone. Before they could react, footsteps erupted from below, heavy, wet thuds against the wood. A guttural, inhuman noise, like a drowned voice trying to form words, sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Then the pounding started. Doors burst open down the hall, and from the stairwell, figures emerged. Tall, elongated bodies, their skin pale and slick, their round, reflective eyes catching the dim light. Gills flared at their throats as they advanced. Ethan's breath hitched. They were cornered. Richard raised his axe, stepping in front of Ethan. "Get ready!" The creatures charged. Ethan barely had time to react before one lunged at him, its long fingers reaching for his throat. Instinct took over. He swung the rusted machete, slicing into its shoulder. The thing let out a choked gurgle, but didn't stop. It slammed into him, sending him crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. Richard let out a feral yell as he buried his axe in another's skull, yanking it free with a sickening squelch. The creature fell, twitching, but it didn't get back up. They could die. That thought gave Ethan the strength to move. The creature on him bared jagged teeth, forcing his machete arm down. Its gills pulsed, its breath reeking of rotting fish. With all his strength, Ethan wrenched his free hand up and jammed his thumb into its eye. The thing let out a shriek, its grip faltering. That was all he needed. He forced the machete up and drove it into its throat. A wet, gasping sound. It collapsed. Ethan staggered back, his body shaking. His hands were slick with blood. Richard was panting, a deep gash across his arm. 3 bodies lay at their feet, motionless. They had survived, but they weren't unscathed. Ethan wiped his face, trying to slow his breathing. The creatures were dead, but more would come. They needed to go. Richard looked at him, sweat and blood streaking his face. "They bleed," he muttered. "They die." Ethan nodded, still catching his breath. They weren't invincible. Then Richard's eyes shifted toward the open stairwell, toward the shadows beyond. "They'll know what we did." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Then we move now." The cave loomed before them, its entrance a jagged wound in the earth, swallowing all light beyond its threshold. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Every step down the uneven stone path sent small echoes rippling through the hollow tunnels. They had followed the faint, wet footprints left by the ritualists, winding through narrow alleyways and salt-crusted paths toward the cliffs. In the distance, a faint glow flickered, half hidden by the jagged rock formations near the water's edge. As they crept closer, they saw a procession of figures, silent and swaying, vanishing into a massive jagged opening, a cave mouth obscured by overgrown brush. The whisper of inhuman voices chanting had slithered through the wind, sending shivers down their spines. With no other choice, they had followed. Ethan gripped the machete tighter. This was it. Somewhere below, a sound rumbled through the cavern, a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the rock. Not human, not of this world. And then, they saw it. A massive underground chamber stretched before them, illuminated by eerie, flickering torches. The ground sloped downward, leading to a deep, inky pool of water, blacker than night. Dozens of figures encircled the pit, their bodies grotesque and deformed. Elongated limbs, slick, grayish skin, bulbous lidless eyes that glowed faintly. They swayed, humming in unison, a guttural, wet chant reverberating through the chamber. Suspended above the water, tied by her wrists to an ancient stone pillar, was her, Richard's wife. She was barely conscious, her head slumped forward, her skin pale under the torchlight. Her feet dangled just above the surface, where something stirred beneath, something waiting. The water rippled. Then, with a slow, monstrous groan, tentacles began to rise. Long, slick, pale gray appendages slithered out of the abyss, their suckered surfaces twitching as they reached upward. A sound followed, a deep, ancient guttural growl, low, vibrating through Ethan's bones. It was not a sound meant for human ears. It was a god waking from its slumber. Richard's breathing turned ragged. His wife was seconds away from being devoured. Without hesitation, he sprinted forward. Richard reached her just as one of the creatures cut the rope. For a fleeting second, time stood still. She dropped. Her eyes snapped open, locking onto Richard's. The pure terror in them was the last thing he saw before she vanished beneath the surface. Then came the sickening squelch of flesh and the gurgled scream. Then silence. The thing beneath the water had swallowed her whole. Richard froze. A moment of pure, unfiltered horror twisted his face. Then it turned into rage. He let out a guttural scream, lifting his axe high before charging into the mass of cultists. Ethan barely had time to react before Richard was already slashing, hacking, cutting them down. The grotesque figures shrieked, their webbed hands clawing at him, but he didn't stop. Ethan rushed in beside him, swinging the machete. One of them fell, gurgling, its throat split open. The cavern erupted into chaos. They were outnumbered. More figures poured in from the shadows, slithering forward, their gurgling chants turning to shrieks. Richard fought like a man possessed. He cut them down one by one, but there were too many. A massive shadow loomed behind him. Ethan saw it too late. A monstrous creature, unlike the others. Larger, hunched, its body slick and pulsating. Its maw opened wide, revealing endless rows of needle-like teeth. Richard turned just as the thing lunged. It tore into him, dragging him into the writhing mass. Ethan shouted his name, but there was no answer. Blood sprayed across the stone. Richard was gone. A cold dread settled into Ethan's bones. He had to run. Ethan turned and bolted toward the exit, but they were after him. The creatures poured toward him, scrambling over the rocks, their guttural shrieks filling the cavern. One leaped at him from the side. He barely dodged, swinging his machete wildly. The blades sliced through its throat, but others were closing in. A massive tentacle slammed into the stone beside him, sending shards of rock flying. Ethan stumbled but kept moving. Then, suddenly, the world around him faded. The shrieks, the rushing footsteps, the overwhelming terror, it all melted into silence. Ethan felt a strange warmth in his mind, a presence soothing, inviting, a voice, her voice, the woman from his dream. "Don't run. Stay with us. We will not harm you. You belong here." For a moment he believed her. The fear drained from his body. The idea of giving in, of becoming one of them, seemed peaceful. A vision flashed before his eyes. Himself, standing beside them, his body changing, adapting. No more fear, no more pain, just eternity beneath the waves. Then, a piercing roar from the abyss shattered the illusion. The burning pain in his chest returned. The vision fractured. Ethan gasped, stumbling forward. It had almost taken him. He forced himself into a full sprint, the spell broken, his heart hammering in his chest. Through the tunnels, up the uneven path, until he saw moonlight ahead. The roar of the thing below followed him, rattling his skull, whispering in a language he did not understand. The moment he burst out of the cave's mouth, he collapsed, gasping for breath. The town lay before him, silent, waiting. But Ethan knew he was not safe yet. The first rays of dawn barely touched the town when the gunfire started. Ethan was staggering through the empty streets, his breath ragged, his his body screaming for rest. His legs burned, his vision swam, but he kept moving. He had to. They were still behind him. Then, a deafening crack split the air. The sharp rattle of automatic gunfire. Ethan froze, heart pounding. It wasn't the creatures. Men in black tactical gear swept through the streets, rifles raised, orders shouted through radios. Ethan barely had time to react before a red laser sight locked onto his chest. "Down on the ground, now!" He threw his hands up, falling to his knees. "I'm human. I'm human." For a moment, nothing happened. The soldiers hesitated. One of them stepped forward. Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his throat as the soldier aimed at his face. Then, "He bleeds red. Stand down. He's one of us." The gun lowered. Strong hands pulled him to his feet. The town behind him erupted in chaos. Explosions rocked buildings, fire spread, and the streets filled with the screams of inhuman creatures caught in the crossfire. A military chopper thundered overhead, its searchlight sweeping across the carnage. "Let's move!" someone barked. Ethan was shoved toward an armored truck. He turned, glancing back one last time. The town was burning. The ritualists, the creatures, everything was being erased. A soldier muttered, "No one ever hears about this." Then the doors slammed shut. The nightmare was over. Weeks passed before he finally stepped onto his front porch. The air was crisp, clean. No stench of rot, no humid weight of the ocean pressing on his chest. Just home. The door burst open before he could knock. His mother threw her arms around him, sobbing. Ethan barely had time to react before his father joined, then his sister, their warmth crushing him, overwhelming him. He let them. He cried, too. Marcus was there, too, standing in the doorway, watching. For the first time, Ethan saw real relief on his face. "Damn," Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "I thought you were dead, man." Ethan let out a weak laugh, though something inside him felt hollow. Me too. That night, the news played quietly in the background. The FBI has confirmed that a dangerous cult was dismantled in a joint military operation. Reports state that the group was involved in human trafficking and violent rituals. Details remain classified. Ethan stared at the screen. That wasn't the truth, but it was the only truth that would ever exist. The NDA he signed ensured that, not that it mattered. He didn't want to talk about it anyway. Some things should stay buried. He turned off the TV. That night he slept soundly for the first time in weeks, until he dreamed. He stood in the ocean. The moon was enormous, its silver light reflecting off the rolling waves. The water was warm, swirling around his ankles. Peaceful. Then, she stepped forward. The woman from before. The one from his dreams. The one that had called to him. Her dark eyes shimmered with something ancient, knowing. She smiled. "You can't run forever, Ethan." She reached for him. Ethan gasped awake. His room was silent. The night was still.